All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third session in the 2016 installment of Local Foods College. So glad that you folks are able to join this evening. Just so you're aware, on the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see the list of participants as well as the chat box. And that chat box is what you'll want to use to send questions to myself. By the way, I'm Noelle Harden, and I'm the host this evening. And you also can send them to both myself and the presenter as well. And if you have any troubleshooting issues, just type those into the chat box as well, and I'll help you work through those. And without further ado, I will introduce our guest this evening. Valerie Gamble is the Outreach and Delegation Coordinator for the Food and Feed Safety Division at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Prior to this position, she was a supervisor and field inspector for the food program. She has a master's degree in Geological Sciences and an undergraduate degree in Biology and Geology. Valerie worked for 5 years with organic and conventional farms and orchards in California, first directly with farms and then with the Agricultural Extension Program out of UC Davis. All right, and with no further ado, Val, you can take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Noelle. And I do apologize for my video not functioning. We were hoping that it would work, so I guess I will be faceless tonight while I'm talking. But good evening, and I'm very happy to be here tonight talking about food regulation. And I'd like to just start out with a really quick survey using the polling function, just to see how many people, if I can get that to work, just to see how many people are actually interested in selling food in Minnesota. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in. Okay. Give it a minute or so here. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share the results once this is finished processing. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. It looks like we have 16 people that are interested in selling food, 2 that are not, and a few that didn't answer, which is fine. I was just curious because we speak to a variety of audiences, so wanted to get some idea about what people were interested in. And hopefully this presentation will answer some questions or come up with new things to think about anyway. So here's just kind of a general outline of what I'd like to talk about tonight. So whether you are thinking about selling food or not, I'm just going to go through some of the basics of food regulation in the state. So we'll talk about definitions for food and sales, different types of licenses that are available. And then I'm going to touch on 3 of our biggest food license exclusions: product of the farm, the cottage food exemption, and then a sampling exemption. And then some other requirements that have to do with approved water facilities. I'm going to talk a little bit about on-farm food service and hopefully provide some reference material there, and then talk about some resources that we have as well at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and then also through the Minnesota Farmers Market Association. So just to start out, this definition of food is actually from our state statute. As you can tell, the language is really dense and very legal. But basically what it means is that everything edible, including alcohol, dietary supplements, chewing gum actually is also in this, is considered food in the state of Minnesota. So this kind of provides the foundation of what we do at the Food and Feed Safety Division, since we inspect and regulate food for safety. So we look at what is actually defined as food in the state. Kind of building off of that definition then, we look at our statutory definition of sell and sale, which is also extremely long and very, very much written in legalese. But basically it means if you do anything with food in Minnesota, it is considered a sale. Now that kind of doesn't apply to private events. We all handle food in our homes, but the licensing statute actually pulls that out by saying that if you're handling food and it's not for a business, then you wouldn't be under this regulation. So it's kind of the line between someone who's actually operating a food business and those of us who just prepare dinner at home. So at a really broad level, licenses are required for food products that are bought and resold, and that does include ingredients. That can include complicated products. It could include vegetables or produce. So if you buy produce from somebody else and then resell it, you do need a license in the state. It includes products where you've purchased an off-farm ingredient and added that to something that you've grown yourself. So let's say you're making pickles from cucumbers that you grew yourself, but you bought vinegar and salt to add to those cucumbers. Those would be considered off-farm ingredients. And if you were selling that to restaurants or something like that, you would need a license to do it. And we just kind of remind people to consider all ingredients that are going into your product. So salt, flavors, colors, preservatives, things that are kind of in smaller quantities, but still can kind of push you over that line from not needing a license to needing a license. So food licensing in Minnesota is actually done through two state departments, the Department of Agriculture, which is the department that I work for, and then also the Department of Health. And we each have our own licensing statutes and our own statutes that kind of tell us what we can do and how we regulate. And then we also, both agencies have the authority to delegate inspection and licensing. So the Minnesota Department of Agriculture currently has delegated authority for retail food inspection to 7 other agencies, and they're listed on this slide. So Hennepin County, Ramsey County, the City of Bloomington, the City of St. Cloud, the City of Minneapolis, the City of Minnetonka, and the City of Brooklyn Park. Those agencies actually are also delegated through the Department of Health, but the Department of Health has quite a few more than that. They actually have 31 agencies that they delegate to. And both of the agencies have exclusions from licensing in statute, and we're going to touch on just a few of those that are in our Department of Agriculture statutes. The Department of Health has a completely different set. So licensing can get a little complicated, but we're trying to kind of break it down into its the most basic components that we can get to. So between the two agencies, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture generally covers food through retail sale, wholesale, and like food manufacturing plants. We also do pet food and commercial feed, and dairy farms, dairy plants, custom exempt meat processors, and Minnesota Equal to meat processing plants. So that's all under the inspection authority of the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. The Minnesota Department of Health does food and beverage establishments, so they're more on the food service side. They do restaurants, schools, cafes, food carts, special event food stands, seasonal food stands.
Hey, Val.
Mm-hmm.
We've had one question come in already that relates to the meat issue.
Okay.
Becky is wondering if there's a market for older sheep or mutton.
Okay. So whether there's, that's a good question. I don't know, I guess, whether there's actually a market for it in Minnesota. There's certainly nothing that would prevent you from processing older sheep in the state, as long as you were doing it under inspection, or if you were doing it as a custom exempt, it would have to follow the requirements for that process. So there isn't anything that we would enforce that would say that you couldn't do that. But whether or not there's a kind of a sales market for it, that I'm not sure. That's a good question.
I guess not to throw you off track, but I'll add one of our later sessions of Local Foods College will relate directly to livestock. So that might be a good time to bring that question back, Becky. So, all right, sorry for the interruption, and please carry on.
No, thank you. That's great. I was wondering if maybe there was another one that might be able to answer that. And maybe I'll sign into that one too, because I'm curious. In terms of the specific licenses that we have, we do the wholesale food handler license, which is basically a warehouse. So if you're just handling packaged food and then selling it to grocery stores or restaurants, that would be that category. Then we have the wholesale food processor manufacturer license. So anyone who's producing food and then selling it to restaurants or other stores or other distributors, basically anyone who's producing it and then selling it not to the end user would fall into that category. And then our retail food handler category is where most of the grocery stores in the state fall. So it just means that you're selling directly to the end consumer, so the person that actually is going to eat the food. And then the retail mobile food handler is for people that do events and set up tables. So some people that go to farmers markets are actually licensed by us with this retail mobile food handler license. And then people that do the state fair or county fairs or other craft shows, they would end up typically getting the retail mobile food handler license, as long as they fell under the inspection authority from the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Health licenses are basically split between the food and beverage service establishment, which is the name, and then the special event food stand category. So they have a variety of different types of establishments, but they would all fall under that food and beverage service establishment license, unless they're just operating for a really short amount of time, which would be the special event food stand. And that little picture on the slide is just an example of one of our licenses. So it's just a plain white piece of paper. It says what type of license it is. That is actually an example of a cottage food producer registration, but it's probably too small to read, I think, on the screen. So there are exemptions from licensing for some food businesses, and we we, with the regulatory authority and regulatory agency perspective, tend to kind of assume everyone needs a license and then back up and see, okay, do you fall under one of our licensing exclusions? So initially when someone calls, we start out by saying that most people need licenses, but then sometimes we have people that fall into one of these categories. And I'm just focusing on 3 tonight because I was thinking these might be of the most interest, but we do have some others that are kind of for very limited food sales at pharmacies or locations that don't primarily sell food. So there's some other odd exemptions and statutes for licensing. But we're going to focus on product of the farm, which is person selling products of the farm or garden, cultivated by them. And then our food product and sampling demonstration exemption, and then the cottage food exemption. So for product of the farm, I broke it down into a couple different categories. The first one would be sort of the general produce category. So fresh, raw produce grown on the farm, and this could be in someone's backyard as well. It doesn't have to be what we would think of as a traditional farm. It can be processed with no off-farm ingredients, so you could make, let's say you grow lavender and you have your own honey, then you could make lavender flavored honey from product that you grew yourself, and that would still fall under this exemption. Honey and maple syrup, as long as it's either from your own land or rented land, would also fall under this. And the honey, people tend to have hives quite often not on their own land. As long as it's all your own hives and they're your own bees, then that's fine. I think it would be very difficult to make sure that all of your hives were actually on your own land. So when we're looking at the produce side of this, as long as the produce is fresh, raw, not processed, you don't need a license. You can do sorting, trimming, husking, preliminary washing. That would all be fine in this category. Let's see, I did see that question come in. So how about maple syrup from national or state forest land? So that sometimes you can run into, okay, so the state forest land would be whether the DNR allows it or not, so you can run into DNR regulations with that. But as long as it's not your land or land that you're actually renting, then you would actually need a license to do it. So there are kind of 2 different things we would look at there. If you were okay with the DNR regulations, which I would have to check. I'm not sure where they are with the state forest land. I think state parks, they tend to be against most harvesting and food harvesting. But if they were okay with it on state forest land, we would still ask that you have a license to do that because it's not land that you're either owning or renting. In terms of fresh, raw, processed food that doesn't have any purchased ingredients, you still actually don't need a license to sell those products, but you do have to use an approved facility to do that processing. And when we're talking about processing, that's something like heating, freezing, cutting, dicing, mixing, canning, or bottling. And we'll get into what an approved facility would be a little bit later on here. And then the final piece on this slide is if you're doing fresh, raw produce and you add purchased ingredients. So again, if you're adding vinegar or salt or something like that, you would need a license to do that. For the product of the farm, meat and eggs category, meat and poultry from your own animals and birds would fall under this exemption, as would shell eggs from your own flock. So that can still be considered product of the farm. In terms of meat, it needs to be the animal that you own, and the resulting product needs to be a single ingredient product. So you can't have multiple ingredient sausages or something like that fall under product of the farm. And in order to sell it to the general public, it needs to be slaughtered and processed under continuous inspection. So that could either be equal to inspection or USDA inspection. And that's the difference between those two would be the equal to inspection is done by our state Department of Agriculture meat program. And it just means that if you go to an equal to plant, you can only sell that meat within the state. If you go to a USDA inspected plant, you can sell across state lines. So it just depends what kind of market you're looking for with that. And then again, if you have a multi-ingredient product, like a sausage with 10 ingredients in it, that would be something that would actually need a license. I did see, let's see, there was a question about whether harvesting counted as cutting, like harvesting microgreens. So yes, you could harvest microgreens. That would actually fall under the what you could do in the field kind of section. So you don't need to harvest microgreens in an approved facility. There's a difference between just cutting the leaf petiole, which is generally what you would be doing there, and then actually taking, let's say you did harvest a bunch of spinach or something like that, and then taking it and actually chopping up the leaves. That chopping up the spinach leaves would be something that you would need to do in an approved facility. But again, just harvesting microgreens you could do wherever it was being grown. That would be fine. So a little bit more on meat. If you are exempt from licensing, the meat program does ask that you have approved storage and delivery equipment. And generally, when we're talking about approved, the word approved, we get back to, is it cleanable, is it smooth, durable, are the surfaces in good condition? If you have mechanical delivery equipment that's keeping your meat cold, does it function properly? And meat that is held under mechanical refrigeration, that's a requirement if it's out longer than 4 hours. So if you were going to a farmer's market that was 2 hours away from your house and the market lasted 4 hours, and then you had a 2-hour drive home, you would end up being out longer than 4 hours. So at that point, you would need mechanical refrigeration. And that's instead of ice packs, basically, or some other non-mechanical type. And this slide also has the inspected slaughter and processing establishment contact numbers. So you can always contact the USDA if you're looking for a plant, or you can contact our department, and we keep a list of the places in the state that are under meat inspection. So in terms of labeling for meat, it would need to have the product identity, the inspection brand, which is that mark of inspection, and there are some examples down at the bottom of the slide. A list of ingredients, which again, if you're product of the farm, it would be single ingredient, so product identity usually covers that. And then name, address, and zip code. So the contact information is generally required on all food labels. In case something happens, we need to be able to get back to whoever produced or sold that so we can, kind of trace it and make sure that we cut off any potential foodborne illness outbreaks or problems that are associated with that product. And these marks of inspection are all USDA marks of inspection. The Minnesota state mark of inspection is similar, but it actually is in the shape of the state of Minnesota. So in terms of eggs, as long as they're from your flock, you don't need a license to sell them. And we're talking about shell eggs. There is a registration form that you have to fill out with the Department of Agriculture, and that's available online through our website. And you can sell shell eggs to grocery stores, restaurants, or for food service without a license, as long as they're eggs from your own flock. We do ask that they're in clean condition, and the recommendation is to use sandpaper for that. Wet cleaning can be a problem because the water can actually get through the shells if it's not done under kind of controlled conditions, and then you can transmit bacteria into the egg, which can cause more problems down the road. And then they do have to be placed into a clean container, and that could be a crate, it could be a flat, it could be, just the regular cartons that you see in the grocery store. Handling, grading, and sizing is required, and that can be done by either the farmer or the purchaser of the eggs. And there's a handbook on grading eggs that's available online. Refrigeration is required, and then again, there are labeling requirements for eggs as well. Basically the same as the meat, except you need the grade and size, the pack date, and then also a safe handling statement. Just a brief mention about milk. Raw milk can't be sold at farmers market or community events. It can only be sold off the farm where it was produced, and it can be purchased for personal use only. And the main reason for that is just the safety concerns. There have been outbreaks and illnesses linked to raw milk, so the law is set up so that you can go as a consumer and actually buy it, but we want you to go to the source so that you can see how the animals are handled, where they're actually doing the milking. It's kind of a knowing what you're buying requirement. Okay, just a quick overview of the food product sampling and demonstration exclusion. This one actually passed in 2014, so this was kind of a recent exemption for us. There are a couple definitions that are just laid out for this particular section. There's actually a definition for farmers market, which we didn't ever have before. And it's basically as long as there are 3 farmers selling produce together, then that would be a farmers market. It doesn't limit another farmers market or organization from adding on to that definition. It's just kind of defining it for the purpose of this sampling and demonstration exemption. And there are some requirements for the food samples. They have to be offered at no cost. As the regulatory authority, we might ask for the source, the type, the volume of food, equipment that you're using, where are you going to be selling it, what's the source of the water, if you're using any water, and then how will waste be disposed. But basically, we're looking for people to meet the special event food safety and equipment standards, and that's something in one of our state codes. It's the Minnesota Food Code, and it's basically saying that you have to have kind of a cooler set up so that you have hand washing capabilities if you need it, and you can use home equipment. You don't have to have commercial equipment for it. So we're trying to keep the bar as low as possible for this particular exemption. And the idea is that you could do like a cooking demonstration at a farmer's market and you don't need a license for it. That was kind of the big push behind it, so that farmers could have all this beautiful produce, and then you could have somebody at a table right next to them, doing a demonstration to show people what they could do with it, which helps when you have more unusual products that people are not used to cooking. Okay, so the cottage food exemption is probably the one that people have heard the most about. And this one just passed in 2015, so it's still fairly new. So who is a cottage food producer? It's an individual who's making non-potentially hazardous food without inspection and without a license, and they would be doing this in their home kitchen. They're making food that doesn't require time or temperature control to be considered safe. they would be selling directly to the end consumer, and they do have to register with the Department of Agriculture. So there were some changes from previous exemptions that we had. We used to have an exemption that allowed non-potentially hazardous foods to be sold at farmers markets. And we also had something called the pickle bill, which allowed home pickled products to be sold at farmers markets. And what happened is that those two exclusions actually were combined, and the language is virtually identical to what it was before, but it's placed into one exemption, which is now called the cottage food exemption. So two became one, which is a little bit easier for all of us, actually. But in addition to that, there were some changes in the language around some of the other pieces that were required. So now there are two different sales tiers that are allowed under the cottage food exemption. And it opened up where you could do the selling. So previously you could only sell at farmers markets or community events. Now you can do both of those, but you can also sell directly from your home, and you can sell online. The sales do have to be direct to the end consumer. So if you're taking orders online for food products, you as the producer actually have to deliver that product to the person that was buying it, or they could come to your house and pick it up. So those are kind of the two options. And then the food safety and training and registration is also required now. That was not previously the case.
Val, we've had a couple questions come in relating to previous material that you covered.
Okay.
So the first one, does Minnesota allow delivery of raw milk to consumers who own their own goat on your farm, as some states allow?
Minnesota does not currently allow that.
Okay, well that was an easy one. And then another question, based on my understanding, chickens release a coating onto the shell of their eggs that prevents spoiling. Why is it still a requirement to clean eggs prior to sale?
So the requirement for cleaning is it's more just to remove kind of large pieces of debris. So if you're, I'm not sure that cleaning is necessarily the correct term, but that's the language that was used in the regulation, so that's kind of what we're stuck with. But I mean, the idea is if there's a lot of feces or something on the egg, that's what you're trying to get off, but you don't actually want to really scrub at it.
Okay, and we've had another question come in related to the cottage food exemption. Where do we find the training and registration for food safety?
So that is actually towards the end of the presentation, I do have the website link. We currently have the training available through our website, through the MDA website online. So you can go there, and it's just a set of PowerPoint slides that have been made into a PDF file. And you can run through that training, and then there's also a link to the registration form on that same website. So you can download the registration form, complete it, and send it into our office. There are also the Farmers Market Academy classes that the Minnesota Farmers Market Association is doing right now. And I think they've done 6 so far around the state, and then they have 2 more scheduled for February. And that is a much more in-depth look at the cottage food safety training. So you can alternatively go and take that training in person, and that would also count, and you could fill out the registration form and send it in that way after you've taken that training. So those are the 2 options right now. It's not, the training actually isn't limited to, being presented by by the Department of Agriculture or by an association. I do know of at least one consulting firm that's interested in developing training for it, so there may be multiple places that you can pick it up in the future, but right now it would either be through our website or through the Minnesota Farmers Market Association.
I just posted the link to the PDF that Val was referring to. Val, we've got a couple more questions, if that's okay. Can a husband and wife each have $18,000 of sales?
Yes, as long as you're both registered. So you would both need to take the training and then fill out the registration form, and then you would each have the sales limit of $18,000.
And this one I know you'll probably be getting to, but there's a question about whether dehydration would also fall under the cottage food exemption.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, we'll get to that in just a couple slides. So along the lines of that question about the husband and wife, on this slide, it talks about who the cottage food exemption applies to, and currently it applies to individuals and not businesses. So businesses would include firms, partnerships, cooperative societies, associations, LLCs, companies, corporations. Basically, if you have a business that's registered with the Secretary of State in Minnesota, you can't register for the cottage food exemption. So it has to be either you as an individual, or you can register as a sole proprietorship because you're still basically an individual at that point. But those are the only two options at the moment. I know that there are some people looking at the legislative session coming up in 2016 to see if that language can be changed at all. So that would be something to watch moving forward, is whether or not this is going to continue to just be individuals, or if they'll open it up and allow other people, or to actually allow businesses to do this registration as well. But for right now, it's just individuals. So again, each person who's involved in the business needs to do the training and then fill out the registration form, and then you would have the sales limit. It allows sales of non-potentially hazardous foods and or home canned pickles, vegetables, or fruits as long as they have a pH of 4.6 or lower. The food safety training is actually required just once every 3 years. And it's broken out a little differently for the two tiers. So the first tier is if you're selling $0 to $5,000 per year. You can complete the training course and do the exam and do it online, and you're good to go for that one. The second tier is $5,000 to $18,000 per year. Right now, you can still complete the food safety training online because we don't have any alternative. If the alternative training gets developed, and the University of Minnesota Exemptions program is actually working on developing that training to be released at some point during 2016. Once that training is released, then to qualify for this $5,000 to $18,000 tier, you would have to take their training. But for right now, we don't have it, so either one can be accomplished under the current online training or the Minnesota Farmers Market Academy. So the only thing that it's maybe more of a problem for us to keep track of, but it's a little tricky that the training is required once every 3 years, but the registration is required every year. So they don't correspond exactly, but we're working on a database that will track that will hopefully just send emails to people every 3 years to say, hey, you know, it's been 3 years since you've had training. If you're still interested, you should probably do it before the end of this calendar year or something like that. So we're working on that part of it. These are examples of potentially hazardous food items that would not be allowed. So foods from animals or aquatic species, like raw or cooked. So we're talking about, meatloaf or baked salmon, that would not be allowed under the cottage food exemption. Cooked plants, so cooked rice or steamed green beans, that would not be allowed. And then raw seed sprouts, cut melons, cut fresh tomatoes, cut leafy greens, again, not the microgreens, but again, if you were chopping up spinach or chopping up the microgreens, that would be cut leafy greens. And then garlic and oil mixtures. And this last group of products is coming out of science that's been documenting outbreaks for probably the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years. These products have been highly associated with outbreaks, so they're now considered to be potentially hazardous foods. And that science is always changing, so every now and then the potentially hazardous food list will shift a little bit. So we try and stay on top of that and try and get that information out to people as quickly as possible when there is a change. Here's some examples of non-potentially hazardous foods that you can make at home and sell. So acidified or acidic fruits, vegetables, pickles. There are some fermented foods that would qualify. Vinegar, condiments, baked goods, candy, and confections. Here's the dried, dehydrated, and roasted items. So you could do dried herbs, you could do roasted nuts. I know we've gotten that question. You could do dehydrated products under this exemption. You can also do icings, frostings, sugar arts, and then the jams, jellies, preserves, and fruit butters. So again, the items that were previously covered under the non-potentially hazardous farmers market exemption and the pickle bill are just kind of rolled together into this exemption. And the only thing that we try to keep in mind with this is that sometimes, depending on the recipe, some of the items could still be potentially hazardous. So every now and then we will come across something that, has a very unusual recipe, and it's, for whatever reason, it has a really high water activity, much higher than that product normally would have. Like if you made banana bread and it had 10 bananas in it rather than 2 or something like that, the water activity would be much higher, and that potentially could be a problem. It still might be okay. It's just something that we would look at a little bit more closely. So we're always just trying to evaluate how close the product is to the basic food safety parameters, and we're mainly looking at pH level and water activity for this one. So under a pH of 4.6 and under a water activity of 0.85. Those are our cutoffs. And then this last slide is just a little bit about the labeling requirements for the cottage food exemption. So the label needs to include the name and address of the individual preparing and selling the food. It has to have the date on which the food was prepared, and the complete list of ingredients, including any allergens. And the allergens that are listed on the slide are what are considered the big 8. So we have eggs, milk, wheat, tree nuts, peanuts, soy, fish, and crustacean shellfish. And those are associated with 90% of the food allergies in the United States right now. This is another list that may change in the future. Again, that's something that we try to keep track of and let people know about as soon as changes come out. Other countries actually have a much longer list than we do. So things like sesame and mustard are considered allergens in Canada that need to be labeled, and then those are kind of under review in the United States right now. The one thing that we try to always tell people when they call us or when we're talking about licensing exemptions and other regulations is just that if you're exempt from licensing, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're exempt from inspection. So it also doesn't mean that you're exempt from all food safety and sanitation regulation and requirements. So even if you don't have to have a license from us, we would still require that you follow whatever food safety rules would apply to the product that you're making, and that's just to make sure that whatever food is being provided to the public is safe, basically.
All right, Val, this seems like it might be a good opportunity to take some questions. I have 3 that have come in.
Okay.
So James is wondering what rules might apply to selling mushrooms either grown on the farm or collected from the wild.
Okay. So cultivated mushrooms, if they're grown on your own farm or in your own basement, which we've certainly gotten that question before, it doesn't really matter where they're grown. If they're grown on your own property, that would still fall under product of the farm. We do ask, if you're doing your own mushroom cultivation, that you get your initial kind of starter spores or your starter mushroom material from an approved source, and just know that, you know, it's been verified that you're getting the kind of mushroom that you think you're getting. What we don't want is for someone to think that they're growing oyster mushrooms and it turns out that it's actually, you know, something else that may be toxic. So we just want to make sure that your initial supply is coming from a place that's reputable and is giving you a guarantee that you're buying what you think you're buying. In terms of wild mushroom harvesting, if you harvest mushrooms on your own land, that would still fall under product of the farm, so you wouldn't need a license to do it. If you're going out into other land, kind of along the lines of the maple syrup on state forest land, if you go into state forest land, you would need a license to do that, if you're planning on selling them, I should say. Either way, you know, the licensing only applies if you actually want to sell the product that you're interested in. So for wild mushrooms, that's where the licensing line is. And then the other thing that you have to follow for wild mushrooms is that you need to go through what we call a certification course, and that has to be offered either through a university, college, or a mycological society or association. And they give you a certificate saying that you're certified to harvest XYZ mushrooms. So there have been some that the University of Minnesota has put on that are for morel harvesting, and then giant puffballs, black trumpets, and chanterelles, I think, are the 4 that they've done before. And you can find different courses kind of around the upper Midwest that talk about different mushrooms and get certified. And then once you have that certificate, you just need to send it to us at the Department of Agriculture, and we keep a list. And then restaurants can buy from you as long as you're certified, and they can always call us and ask, you know, to verify if somebody has their certificate on file. We're actually working on maybe getting that list online, so it's a little bit easier for restaurants to check on that too.
All right, thank you. We have a couple questions related to eggs. So the first one, someone says, I used to not wash eggs before refrigerating, but wash them before cooking, but I got concerned about microscopic manure from handling, washing, pre-cooking. So now I wash all my eggs after collecting them. What are your thoughts on that practice?
That may be something. I'm definitely not an egg expert, so that may be something that I could certainly run by our meat and dairy program, because they're the ones that do egg inspection in the state. So if there's a way to get an email address, I can follow up on that question after this.
Great. So if the person who had that question, if you'd like to send your email address directly to Val, then she can follow up with you. And you can do that using the chat box. Oh, and it looks like she just sent it to you. So
Perfect. Thank you.
Able to see that?
Yeah.
And one more question here. Last year we had a question about homemade noodles. Are noodles allowed since they do contain raw eggs? We covered it last year by labeling, by having a label that stated not to be eaten raw and must be cooked. Is that all right?
So I'm assuming this would be for noodles that would be dried and not fresh noodles that would be refrigerated. So as long as I'll go with that. As long as we're talking about noodles that are in a dried state, the water activity would be kind of the controlling factor there. And just having that statement would be fine. So the product itself that you're selling would be non-potentially hazardous in its dried form, but then you would want people to cook it before they actually ate it.
Okay, perfect. And they were referring to dried noodles, so
okay.
That's great. And that's all the questions we have for now.
Okay. Just writing a note about sending an email. Okay. Just a few other requirements that I put in here. This is more if we're looking at kind of a licensing situation, we'd be looking for an approved water source. So we do look at, if you're on municipal water, that would be something that's generally approved without any issues. Well water is where we get to start talking with the Department of Health, and we'll look at construction requirements. Also isolation distances, so how far away is your well from your septic system or from an animal feedlot or something like that. And the Department of Health does have a well owner's handbook online, which has quite a bit of useful information just for private wells, but also that could be helpful for trying to figure out whether or not your well would be approved. In terms of an approved facility, this again is something that we would look for if you are needing a license. So we would make sure that local building, plumbing, fire, electrical, zoning codes are all met, that if your locality, city, county, authority does issue certificates of occupancy, that there is one for that space. The equipment would need to be NSF or commercial equivalent, depending on what you're doing. NSF is required for retail. Commercial equivalent would be more on the wholesale side. And then we look for water, plumbing, and septic systems to be certified, approved, safe. Just generally, the space would need to have adequate storage. So if you're in a licensing situation or you have a food business that needs to be licensed out of an approved space, all of your ingredients, equipment, packaging materials, and finished goods would need to be stored in that space. You cannot actually store anything at home. So there needs to be a complete separation between the commercial food and then personal food. We would look for somebody to be in charge. So when we do an inspection, if there are food safety concerns or operational concerns or requirements, we would want to know who that contact person is to go over those concerns. And then we do look at the facility construction itself. Is it, have approved floor, wall, and ceiling materials? Is it smooth, durable, cleanable, that sort of thing? There are a variety of places that you can look to find an approved facility. We have people licensed in church kitchens, community centers, occasionally daycare facilities, although there's kind of an overlapping issue with the health inspection sometimes. Catering facilities often will rent out their kitchens when they're not using them. And if there's ever a facility that you're interested in, you can always call us and arrange a meeting with the local inspector just to get a review of that facility done. There are some additional food safety regulations that can apply depending on what you want to do. So that's kind of our first question when somebody calls and says, I want to start a food business. We'll say, great, what do you want to do? Where do you want to sell? what do you want to actually do with your business? Do you want to sell to restaurants? Do you want to sell to grocery stores? Do you want to sell at the farmer's market? So we're kind of trying to get at your business plan because it helps us figure out which food safety regulations apply in which situation. So like the good manufacturing practices, that's something that would apply to wholesale food manufacturers and warehouses. The Minnesota Food Code is what we use when we're looking at grocery stores. So there's a big difference between the two. We want to make sure that we're applying the correct regulation to your business. There are also product-specific regulations, such as seafood, acidified juice, bottled water regulations. So if you're ever interested in those products, we can direct you to the specific regulations that you would need to meet. And again, this is where we're getting at the fact that licensing and regulation are two separate things. So a good example of this would be if you're doing, let's say, an aquaponics facility. You're growing your own fish, basically, and you're growing your own vegetables, let's say microgreens. So that would all fall under product of the farm. But if you take your fish and you start processing them on site and, doing more than basically just killing them, the seafood HACCP regulation would apply. So there's another regulation that would apply even though you still actually don't need a license. So it's kind of two different boxes that we're looking at: licensing, and then what else would apply in terms of food safety. In terms of on-farm food service, that's a question that we're getting quite a bit more these days. Sometimes you need a license and sometimes you don't. Unfortunately, there's not really a clear answer for that. It really depends on what you're doing. I just put up a page out of the Come and Get It manual, which is something that was released by the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture within the last 6 to 9 months. And this is page 4. It's just a flow diagram about licensing for these on-farm events. And it kind of gets at, the complexity of what we'll ask when you call. And we're saying, are you doing a potluck? Are you wanting to feed friends and family, or do you want to go outside of that? Do you want to just do packaged food? And depending on your answers to those, you may or may not need a license. And this Come and Get It manual is something that's available online, and that website is at the end of this presentation as well. So I just wanted to really briefly touch on some resources that we have at the Department of Agriculture, and will have, I should say. We're really excited, actually, that we're developing a new position within our division, and we're calling it the Licensing Liaison, but it's basically one person who has quite an extensive background in food safety and regulation, and then they would get all telephone, email, and walk-in questions about starting a food business. So it's kind of that one point person who can help answer questions about licensing, exemptions, registrations, how to move forward with your business once you've decided you want to start one. And they'll also be available to go out and meet with people in the field to do these consultations. So we will be doing, we did post that position. It's closed now, and we'll do interviews, I think, within the next week or so. So we're actually looking for this position to start here in February. And the expectation is that all questions that come in will be answered within 1 day. Or if it's impossible to do that, then they would be given an estimated time. So either way, you would get a communication within 24 hours saying, here's the answer, or that's a great question. I need just 2 more days to talk to these 5 people in the office to figure out, what the correct answer is. Here are just a few websites. So we do have a GIS map where you can find your food inspector, and you can just put in your address, and it will pull up the name and phone number for the food inspector for your area. The middle website is the MDA Cottage Food Producer Registration link. And then the bottom website is the Come and Get It manual through the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture. And then, as I mentioned before, the Minnesota Farmers Market Association is doing these Farmers Market Academies, and that specifically would be a great reference for the cottage food exemption because they're doing the 2-hour training as part of that academy, and their website has information on how to register for the last 2 sessions that are coming up in February here in Mankato and Rochester. And that is it.
Okay, so please keep your questions coming in the chat box, and some of you are using the Q&A, which is fine. We've got a couple already. Rosemary would like to know if a CSA farm was to collaborate with a restaurant and wanted to add goods into their CSA boxes, such as fermented goods made by the restaurant in a commercial kitchen and cheese they order from other cheesemakers. Would the CSA farm need any license?
Yes, they would need a license for that. So they would also, at that point, we would also be looking at an approved facility, which, depending on, you know, if they're just kind of holding, sorting, and then redistributing, there are fewer requirements for that space. If you're actually starting to do kind of processing and handling of open products, the requirements increase. But we do have, I want to say, either 2 or 3 CSAs that are currently licensed by the Department of Agriculture in Minnesota that are operating that way. So they're doing produce, but then they also pull in value-added products from producers in the area.
A couple people have requested the resources, the links that you shared, if those could be posted after the session. And yes, we can post those to the local Foods College Moodle site. And so we will make sure that that happens, hopefully over the next few days. Those will be up there. Otherwise, someone asked me to copy and paste them into the chat, but I'm going to need to retype them to do that. So maybe as you're answering the next couple questions, I can do that.
Okay. Here, you know what? I can go back to that slide too. Leave that one up.
Perfect. Okay, that works. So Val will leave it on this slide, and if you need to copy those links, you can go ahead and do that. Someone asked, what is the cost range for licenses?
Good question. So, okay, so because we have different categories, for our retail food licenses, our retail food licensing is different than our wholesale food licensing in terms of pricing. So starting with the retail, it's all based on your gross annual food sales. So kind of the entry-level retail license would be $0 to $50,000 in food sales per year, and that one costs $77. That can range on the retail side all the way up to, gosh, I think our top license is $2,100 something, so right around $2,000, and that would be if your gross annual food sales are over $25 million a year. On the wholesale side, if you're a wholesale manufacturer processor, so if you're actually making the products and then wholesaling, the first category is $0 to $125,000 a year. So as long as you're within that window, the cost for your license would be $169. And then just like on the retail side, it goes up from there to somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000. And again, that would be when you're in sales of 20 million plus. So unfortunately, like most things, it depends, but that's kind of the initial range, is 77 and up on the retail side, and then 169 and up on the wholesale side.
All right, and here's another CSA one. Maybe you already answered this, I'm not sure, but what type of license do those CSA farms with value-added items have?
So generally, I think most of them have retail food handler licenses because they're actually selling directly to the end user. Because people, when people buy into a CSA, they're buying directly from you. I think there may have been one that was licensed as a wholesale food handler, and that was just because of the way that they were set up. They actually were going through kind of another step before they got to the end user, so they weren't selling directly to the end users. So it can be either or. It just depends on how you set up a business. But the traditional CSA model would fall under our retail licensing more often than not because you're selling directly to the end user.
All right. Here is kind of a specific one. I do farmers markets in Minneapolis and have an MDA state-issued retail handler's license. Why does the Minneapolis inspector ask me to apply for their $357 city license?
That is also a good question. So the City of Minneapolis is one of the agencies that we delegate to. So within the boundaries of Minneapolis, they have the authority to license and inspect. Basically, I mean, their license for farmers market sales it's kind of covering that portion of the business. I mean, they're doing the inspection and they're doing the licensing within the city. That is something that has been under discussion and I believe may be changing, so that would be something else to kind of watch for within the next couple of months. I don't know if that will continue to be the case. I can't say for sure because that hasn't been decided, but I know that's something that there are ongoing discussions about.
All right, another CSA question. Does a small CSA that does not sell value-added or processed items, such as only on-farm fresh produce, does that fall under the cottage food exemption?
That would actually fall under the product of the farm exemption. So you would be, I mean, if you grow all of your own food for your CSA, then you would be under product of the farm. And that can be helpful in some ways because there's no sales limit on product of the farm. And you're also not required to register with us. And as long as you aren't doing anything beyond that initial sorting, trimming, washing, husking, kind of that initial vegetable preparation, I don't even want to say preparation, initial minimal vegetable processing that you would do in the field or in the packing shed, you don't need approved facilities to do that stuff. So you would be under the product of the farm exemption as long as it's your own product.
All right, we have a clarifying question related to the question about the state versus the Minneapolis license. So they are wondering if the city license trumps the state license.
No, the state license actually trumps the city license, which is why we're having discussion about it. And I wish I could say 100% for sure that that will no longer be the case that you would need to get to, but it isn't completely decided yet. But the fact that the state license is the language in our licensing statute says that our license is valid statewide when you're in the retail mobile food handler category. That language is kind of what's driving that conversation, that we're really looking into what's happening there and whether that needs to change.
Okay, I'm not currently seeing any more questions. So if you have any, please type them in right now.
I just realized the one thing I didn't put in this presentation was my email address, which I'm happy to give out if people would like to have it. I guess I can just type that in at the bottom, right?
Yeah. Yep, type it in the chat and send it to all participants.
Okay.
That'll be great.
Just in case something comes up later, feel free to email me. And if I don't know, I will try and give you the answer.
And oh, let's see, maybe a question. Somebody would like, oh, okay, there's a couple questions. First, do you need to be licensed to sell shares of an animal you raise on your own land that is processed at a licensed butcher shop and picked up by the consumer at the shop?
No, you wouldn't need a license for that.
And someone else is requesting the dates for the Cottage Food Law certification trainings. Maybe you could go back to that page.
Yep. Oh, and I think the cost for the Farmers Market Academy is $35 per person. I believe that was what was on their website. And they do have both the Cottage Foods presentation and then also a presentation on marketing that I did. I went to one of the academies early on, and the marketing presentation was very interesting as well. So.
Okay, a couple more questions here. Somebody wants to know if a CSA falls under approved facility inspection.
The CSA itself, I mean, if we're talking about like a CSA drop site at somebody's house, no. The only time that it would is if you're in a licensing situation and then you have kind of a warehouse or a building where you're kind of bringing products together and then packing the boxes and then sending them out. So if you, let's say you grow a lot of produce, but there are certain things that you're buying, maybe your neighbor has fruit trees and you're buying fruit from them to put in your CSA boxes, that actually would be a licensing situation because you're buying something from someone else and then reselling it. And at that point, the space where you were putting together those CSA boxes would be what we would look at for facility requirements. And again, the facility requirements themselves would depend kind of on what kind of food was being handled, what processing you were doing, if any. Yeah, it's what the specific requirements would be would really depend, and that's best kind of done with an inspector on site so that you know exactly for your situation what you would need to comply with.
All right, we have another question. Do I need a city license in other jurisdictions, i.e. St. Paul?
No. So the city of St. Paul is actually not delegated. They used to be, but I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, the licensing and inspection authority for the city of St. Paul came back to the State Department of Agriculture and the State Department of Health. So we license and inspect everything in St. Paul that would fall under the Department of Agriculture. So the farmers markets, the grocery stores, gas stations, and then Department of Health licenses and inspects the restaurants and food service facilities within St. Paul.
All right, last call on questions. Give it just a few more seconds in case people are typing. In the meantime, I just would like to encourage everyone to fill out your evaluation about this session. We really value that feedback as we plan next year's Local Foods College sessions. And you should get that in your email inbox either later tonight or in the morning. And also, I'd like to encourage folks to attend our session next week on healthy food access and connecting with opportunities for local growers. And with that, I don't see any more questions come in. So I would like to give a huge thank you to Val for presenting really informative presentation about food regulations. And I thank all of you guys for attending tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great.
So everybody, have a great night and stay warm.
Thanks, you too.